our Carnegie Stanford workshop on security, prosperity, and governance in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Amr Hamzawi. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law at Stanford and a non-resident fellow at Carnegie. And happy to be with you and happy to moderate our second panel. We had a first panel which tackled primarily economic issues as they relate to governance and human security. And in the second panel, we're devoting our attention to security. I wouldn't say security proper, but we will tackle security challenges, human security challenges, as well as other security challenges in three key countries in the Middle East and North Africa. In the order beside me, Egypt, Morocco, and Yemen. And we have three excellent panelists who will enlighten us and share their remarks and then engage with you in hopefully what's going to be a vibrant Q&A session. We have Nancy Uqail to my right. Nancy is Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute based in Washington, D.C. Samia Arzouki, she is a PhD candidate at US Davis in History Department, and she worked for a few years as a Reuters correspondent in Morocco. And Farah al-Muslimi, who is a fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and a co-founder of the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. Let me welcome all of you. We're very happy that you could all make it. Let's start right away by asking you, Nancy, to reflect on, and I'm going to ask Samia and Farah to do exactly the same. If you can, Nancy, reflect on the current security situation in Egypt in 2017, if you could share with us what you consider to be the main security challenges, main improvements with regard to human security or lack thereof since the last major political shift in Egypt took place, which was in 2013.
Thank you, Amran. Thanks for inviting me. And it's really great to be panel with Samia and Farah. He's got great experience in this. Should I raise my voice more? Maybe. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. Well, the short answer to your question, the security situation is going down. I mean, it's not improving. And it's a huge disappointment for a lot of people who basically supported President Sisi in 2013, mainly on the nexus of the idea of security and economic improvement. And we see, I mean, in 2017 today, both indicators of both areas are not looking good at all. The economy is going down. And also the security situation is deteriorating, particularly in Sinai. Since 2013, more vigilant and more established terror organizations are forming and finding place in a home in Egypt. The level of terror attacks that are that we have been tracking at the Tahrir Institute shows that an upward trend. Even, for example, when sometimes the number of terror attacks, if we're talking quantitatively first before we go into the analysis. So, for example, the first quarter of 2017 saw a bit of a decline of the number of attacks in Egypt, going around 136 attacks during that time. However, the number of fatalities of these attacks have, increased. So it's if in economic terms, that looks like the terror groups are being more efficient, doing less and achieving more. Looking at these numbers qualitatively, the number of attacks, the number of fatalities, the targeted attacks, it's going up. So that's not looking good. But also symbolically, how these organizations or terror groups are being established, feeling comfortable, And they are innovating their ways of communicating and improving their media propaganda. They know exactly what are the issues that they play on when they are, for example, trying to recruit. So they know exactly what are the most contentious issues, particularly political issues, that they play on when they send on the propaganda video inviting people to join the groups. Now, a lot of people see this as a simple correlation between it's not really that simple. That it's not every country that has an economic decline suffers terrorism, and at the same time, not every person with a fundamentalist view acts upon it with violence. It's a combination, that a formula that exists right now in Egypt that is taking the country into this very worrying and concerning situation. So just to speak about Sinai, and you're going to find some comparable situations in Yemen and Morocco. So in Sinai, the idea of isolation is not just an economic isolation. It's about, first of all, communications. Communications going in and out. So for example, the northern Sinai have had the communications completely cut, just actually came back today, that the communications started to come back to it. Electricity has been cut for 2 months. It only came back on the 30th of August. Today, there was a statement that was distributed by the company of water utility, saying that they're going to evacuate everything and all the services. So this is a situation that from one side is putting the populations there at distress. But this combination works particularly well for the terror groups, because the terror groups are not good at governance. I mean, they are good at inflicting harm, but they're not able or good at building societies. So it's a situation for them that they don't have to, there are no civic services that are there that they have to keep, that they have to serve. They are dealing with a situation of basically, for them, warriors, and it's normal to be in that situation. So it's a combination from the side of the government unable to serve the population there, and it works very well for the people there. So it further leads to the deterioration of the situation, and also it's an opportunity for the terror groups to recruit. Okay. Now the other thing that works then, when you have nothing to offer, you're not offering anything. And I'm talking, this situation is ironically very comparable between the government and between the terror groups. And the biggest terror group in Sinai, that formerly known as Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, are now Wilayat Sinai, that is affiliated to ISIS. And despite of the defeat in ISIS everywhere, it still symbolically gives them a prestige to pose themselves this way. And although, as I said, when you don't have something to offer, you work very hard on the narrative, on the media narrative. So from the side of the government, there is an intense effort to control the media. From one side, there are 425 websites in Egypt that's been cut. And on the other side, the government is investing very heavily on controlling the media and creating new channels. Intelligence itself has created its own TV channel to control the message. On the other hand, when you have this information gap, because there's no communication coming out, particularly I'm talking now about Sinai, this gives an opportunity for the terror groups to dominate the narrative, because they're very clever at doing this. They're not really that powerful. Their numbers, like by the highest estimate, does not increase 1,000 people, but because they are very good at working on social media over Twitter and Facebook, and there's no counter narrative to them, they are able to exaggerate their presence. They, for example, would set up a checkpoint for 15 minutes, take videos of it, and show that they are in control. An appearance of governance rather than actual governance and control. They also, in April, they showed this, they launched this propaganda video showing how systemic fighters, the snipers, showing, for example, in a course of a video of 17 minutes, 35 military people fought, showing that their capabilities. Where at the same time in the same video, showing those from the side of the Egyptian military looking very, informal, not even wearing the formal attire, army, just being shot randomly. So this is a certain message showing basically the bottom line: we are in control. So that's really problematic. Maybe later when we talk about Yemen, and I don't want to take much time, but also the way of the tribal relations, like tribes like Arabin, and their infighting with ISIS outside of the control of, also makes the situation.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Samia, headlines coming out of Morocco in recent days have been related to two issues. One, the long period of negotiation between different political actors represented in parliament to form a government, which is finally in place. And the second piece of news was related to a wave of protests, which has unfolded primarily in the Rif region. So you get a different picture when compared to Egypt, when compared to many countries in the region. Morocco seems to be a country where we do have a degree of formalized politics and political dynamics being carried out in democratically legitimated institutions. Parliament was elected recently. And on the other side, it seems that Morocco faces a great deal of governance deficits that have eroded human security and have led to that wave of protest which unfolded in the Rif region. If you could reflect on the current security situation, different challenges, and how they relate to governance and the role of politics and political actors, government and other political actors, that would be great. Please.
Yeah, for sure. So it's funny that you bring these two major developments in Morocco because they actually coincided with one another. The protests in the Rif region started in late October after a fish vendor, Mohsin Fikri, was caught selling fish, swordfish specifically, which was illegal to fish during that time of the year. His stock was confiscated by police, thrown into a garbage truck where he was subsequently crushed to death. The incident was documented on a video, and it went viral overnight and immediately triggering protests. At the same time that this happened in October, Morocco just had legislative elections that yielded results where the outgoing government, led by the Party of Justice and Development with Prime Minister Ben Kiran, not only winning elections but actually gaining seats, which, despite the unpopularity of his policies, a lot of people were sort of raising questions about what future that would entail, for the fact that Ben Kiran would have been the first prime minister in Moroccan history to serve 2 consecutive terms as a result of relatively free and transparent elections. To sort of put the protests into context, first of all, and then the government negotiations blockage issue, when the protests started happening in the Rif, the rallying cry was Hugra. And Hugra is essentially this concept of the deprivation of dignity. And as a result, a group of locals from al-Husayma decided to form a small little movement, which would be now referred to as Hirak al-Shabi, or the popular movement. And they drew lessons from the failures of past protest movements in Morocco, namely the February 20th movement. They did this by actually spending 3 months knocking door to door in the city of Husayma and the neighboring towns and villages, asking people what their grievances were. And the result of this was a manifesto with very succinct demands that included having a cancer facility, because the Rif region has the highest rate of cancer. This is actually attributed to the use of chemical weapons during the war with Spain in the 1920s. And a university, in addition to improved infrastructure, namely the construction of a highway that would have connected Husayma to the rest of the country, which has still been on hold despite it was supposed to be completed last year, and jobs, essentially. So the Hirak also distinguished itself from the February 20th movement because it actually had a leader. His name was Nasser Zefzafi, and he was very public and at the forefront, and as a result, he was subsequently arrested in May. And following his arrest, over 300 people have now been arrested since May. protests happening, if not on a daily basis, almost on a weekly basis, and the most sort of violent and extensive use of violence on behalf of the security forces in Morocco in the Rif region, deployment of a disproportionate amount of riot police, gendarmes, and other forms of security, use of tear gas, truncheons that eventually led to the death of one protester and dozens that were subsequently injured. The reason why the Rif region protests are sort of unique, and this touches on the issue of isolation that Nancy was bringing up. The Rif is actually geographically isolated with the Rif Mountains. That's one aspect. It's also sort of historically isolated from the general narrative of Moroccan history. And what we see is that the past 3 monarchs in Morocco have had to deal with social and political unrest in the Rif at one point in their reigns. And each time that it has come up, it hasn't effectively been resolved and addressed. The socioeconomic and political marginalization issues have never fully been addressed. You have Mohammed V in the 1920s with the brief establishment of the Rif Republic that was essentially squashed by the Spanish army, led by Colonel Franco, who actually used the Rif War as a platform for climbing through the ranks and eventually becoming dictator. And essentially the Sultan, Mohammed V at the time, just sort of tacitly sat aside and did not intervene in any way, shape, or form. That is still very vivid in the minds and memories of people in the Rif. And then you have Hassan II, who in the 1980s, in response to bread riots that were a result of increase in food prices, prompted by structural adjustment measures, addressed the protesters in the Rif. Now, mind you, there were protests happening all over the country during the 1980s because of these structural adjustment measures. And in a speech, he notoriously singled out the Rif, calling them scum and basically saying that they live off of theft and trafficking, here referring to the hash trafficking that the Rif is notorious for. And that itself has also remained very vivid in the memories and the minds of the people in the Rif. And this sort of terminology used against the protesters by Hassan II has been revived currently by newspapers that have strong ties to various parties and the state. And now we have Mohammed VI, who is essentially going through a similar situation of political and social unrest in the Rif. And his response has been a sort of a combination of public ambivalence. He mentioned Husseima once in a speech in Throne Day this past July. And basically he mentioned Husseima once in the context of praising the quote-unquote restraint of security forces. And contrarily, actually 2 days ago, or yesterday, the Human Rights Watch published a report saying that the king is essentially condoning these violent security tactics. So all 3 monarchs have failed to address what's going on with the Rif. And so I think that this is just yet another critical juncture in a regime that is very path dependent and has missed a lot of opportunities for forging sort of a more like sense and system of governance that does prioritize accountability. And now going into the issue with the government, we had the 2016 elections, and to prevent this rise of bin Kiran, just to put this, to bring up an anecdote, I was speaking to a government official earlier this year, asking his opinion on what's happening with the king forcing bin Kiran to step aside and instead choosing al-Uthmani, who is perceived as a more docile figure in the party. He told me, listen, there can't be 2 sons in Morocco. And I think this sort of characterizes the dual executive nature of the Moroccan state. You have the king and you have the prime minister. And the power that is shared between them is not equal. The government does respond and is sort of held to account by the monarchy, and this is one of the issues of governance. And so when the Hirak protests started happening, accountability was tossed around like a hot potato. You had the king, the monarchy, the palace that was sort of stepping aside saying, this is not our issue, the government needs to deal with it. The government run and led by the PJD is saying, well, no, we don't hold the majority of the seats in the Rif. They actually are held by the opposition party, the Party of Authenticity and Modernity, which was a party founded by a close friend of the king and current royal advisor. So I think this is emblematic of how the dual executive nature of the Moroccan state functions. And so I think that in some, unless genuine political, economic, and social policies of inclusion are put into place, the Rif protests may subside in the short term, but I think that they will likely recur, and other protests similar to that will happen in the country.
very much, Sam. To you, Farah, I believe Yemen is one of the Arab countries which is suffering from all possible security challenges. Human security issues are in a grave condition from human security, and I'm referring to recent news. We don't get to hear much about Yemen, be it in the US or in fact in the Arab world, and that is very much related to the fact that politics and political interest has moved away from Yemen, apart from regional actors involved in a war of aggression on Yemen itself. But there were recent reports by international organizations on the health conditions of Yemeni children, Yemeni women, on levels of cholera, endemic spread of cholera, and other human security challenges. Yemen has been facing a war of aggression from neighboring countries, Saudi-led coalition, but a civil war in Yemen as well. The Yemeni state has never been a strong state, has never delivered basic services, but whatever delivery existed before the last 2 years is probably gone. So if you can reflect on the security situation in Yemen, and feel free to bring in domestic and regional dynamics, because and international dynamics. Yemen cannot be dealt with away from regional actors and what they do. Please.
Sure. In Yemen, one way to explain the close silence of the media is we say we're Mexico of the Gulf. The same way the Gulf thinks of Yemen, similar to how some Americans think of Mexico. But that's one of the reasons, I think, why it's a very, not an unknown story, but an untold, it's a country of untold stories and issues. With security specifically, there is two themes. One is probably a principle, and one is a technical problem that I think has led the country into this level of insecurity. The principle was a principle that thrived in 2011 via the GCC deal and via many other things that were happening, which was this trading of justice for the sake of security. When someone does a problem or when an institution violates human rights or whatever, it's traded for the sake of security. What did that do? Ultimately, we ended up losing both security and justice. And this is the principle that we have violated in conflict resolutions post-2011, has been one of the main problems of security in the Arab world. In the past, it was the counter-terrorism security. If a regime, or if Mubarak, or if Saleh allows a drone strikes or have a good relationship with the US, he's fine to do whatever he wants locally. The problem is this formula doesn't work, or is not anymore efficient, even from a pragmatic point of view, let alone a moral point of view. And that has, I think, if we zoom out of 2011, look, and this trading of justice was, for example, in Yemen's case, very obvious via the unconditional immunity that was given to President Saleh. That was very dangerous, because it set the legacy of unaccountability and ultimately the legacy of insecurity, I think, that led out of it. So that's the principle we violated, and that's what we ended up with. From a technical point of view, I think the biggest threat to security exists in Yemen and in the region overall, is this increasing phenomena of public committees. It's a phenomena that is getting very popular all the way from Iraq, al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, for example, the ones fighting ISIS, into all the way to Yemen, which is also Lijan al-Sha'biya, or the public committees from both sides fighting. Ultimately, these are parallel armies that reports to no one, that respects no rule, and that basically ultimately end up creating a huge level of insecurity. It's almost nationalization of security. Until 2011, security was a family business thing. So the president has his 2 sons in charge of the top security agencies, his 3rd son in charge of intelligence, and then his nephew in charge of the counter-terrorism unit that was funded by the US. And the National Security Bureau, obviously one of the most famous intelligence and torture bureaus in Yemen. So this was a pure family business, all of security and all of army. We got rid of that, and we completely nationalized it, into public committees. It's no more in the hand of few people from the family, but basically everyone has their own security, and that's a dangerous trend. In Yemen, for example, in the case of Sana'a, the Houthis have their own, they call it the public committees. They report to no one, they have no rules, and no one can ever say anything to them. In Aden, we had what they call the resistance. In Taiz, the Salafis, Abu al-Abbas, very famous militias. So this is a larger problem that's destroying security, and that's leading to a larger further insecurities in the upcoming days. And this is one reason why also armies has not been able to be built, because own or sectarian or different armies have been built on the expense of creating any national army. And that's one of the biggest issues we are facing right now. Let alone when we add to that is the regional arming. So we have a war, clearly in Yemen, a combination of a civil war and regional war, a combination of wars the US is involved in, the Gulf is involved in, Iran somehow more or less is involved in, and everyone has been supplying arms to everyone. And this is another big issue. In Yemen, the UAE created its own military forces in Hadramaut, in Shabwa. Saudis funded different military forces that's not part of the military at all. And that's what happens, I mean, when a war starts and then continues, even though no one really knows why it started, or what is the ultimate what goal out of this. So yeah, I mean, that's from a security point of view, is things are problematic. Now, I don't also, I think there is a lot of blaming too much against the state and how weak the state. Is there a state in Yemen? Is there a stronger state? No. Is there a state that is able to have resources? No. But there is a state. There is a state that has been there for 3,000 years, since the Queen of Sheba, which the Bible and the Quran speaks of. Is it the state we imagine? No. Is it the state that responds to the UN indicators of functioning? No. But it is a state there. And I measure that in the fact that if a country like the US goes through 10% of the violence Yemen is going through, I think it would have already disappeared from the map. But there is a state in Yemen that's deeper than institutions you can measure and you can understand. And this state is what keeps more or less the societies together in the collapse of institutions like we have right now. There is another thing is, there isn't at the moment a single institution in Yemen that combines all of these security agencies together. And that's the most dangerous thing. Yemen is right now fractured into more or less 3 centers of powers. One in Sana'a, under the control of the Houthi Saleh. One in Marib, under the control of the National Army, some Islamists, and some of the President's Alliance. And one in Aden, that's not under anyone's control. Basically a combination of loose alliances between the Hirak, the Southern Movement, and some of the Gulf forces there. Until 9 months ago, these 3 Yemens were talking to each other via the central bank. We had a central bank that was able to collect revenue from Aden, even during the war, and pays the salaries back to the fighters in Aden from both sides. This was a gentleman's agreement that we're not going to destroy this state institution, and that was what kept that place, or that Yemen into one. Since its removal to Aden, a very unthoughtful decision and unpractical decision by the president of Yemen, basically the last thing that was uniting Yemen together is actually collapsed since then. And now even the militaries, for example, in Aden that are being established, or in Sana'a, are being established on a sectarian basis. There is no way you can really at one point mingle or combine these armies together to create a one army together in Yemen.
Very much fair. Nancy, let me come back to you with a question which goes beyond Sinai. So beyond Sinai, Egyptians have been facing very tough times economically. Many segments of the population have been facing tough times politically. I'm referring to human rights abuses, human rights violations, which have been going up in a massive manner since 2013. In fact, one can even argue they never stopped since 2011, in spite of the democratic uprising. So how does the situation beyond Sinai look like from a security perspective, and how do current security challenges relate to governance failures, be it economic failure in the sense of creating jobs, of distributing income in a more balanced manner, Egypt is a place where we have close to 40% of the population living below or around the poverty line. Yes, before the inflation, so we probably it went even higher. And so be it economic deficits or political deficits, when you close off formal politics, when you cancel or attempt to extinct civil society, independent civil society, what happens? What kind of security challenges have been emerging in Egypt away from Sinai?
Well, I mean, it's not any better in all the mainland. Actually, there are more groups that are targeting touristic areas and other like very sensitive targets, and the number of attacks are also on the rise, and more groups are actually forming. Actually, recently, we always heard about attacks from ISIS in Egypt without referring to a particular group forming there. So we were under the assumptions that they are separate cells that are there. However, last spring, in one of the ISIS magazines, but just there had an interview with the emir of the ISIS group in Egypt. That's different than Wilayat Sinai. So that's an indication of more, evolvement of a particular formation of the group, even if this is not really translate into an actual material change. Optics of it, that a group of sporadic, terror attackers are now having some form of coherence, and actually a more form of coherence in terms of what messages and on the messaging and the target. So they also had a shift, and they know how to play on the weaknesses of the government, and I'll explain this shortly. So when they started, when the attack started after 2013, was that they are targeting a government that is illegitimate, unable to deliver in terms of the needs of society. They know exactly how to play on the main political was inherently political, which is also a shift from the terror attacks that we have seen in the they were targeting government people not because they're not politically lacking legitimacy, but because they are infidels, because they are not applying Sharia law. But the discourse has changed after 2013, using even political terms and discourse at heart. All the failures of the Egyptian government actually completely ignored, whereas the rest of the society is a fertile ground actually with sort of a sectarian sense. The Christians or Egyptian Copts as an easy target. And played very well because first it has a currency, and second, it's an easy target. Between 2013 until today, we've seen 500 sectarian attacks. This is a president who came actually presenting himself as someone who is trying to fight Islamism and to protect Christian minorities. So, number of fatalities just in 2015 is just like almost. In 2017. So you see. On these fronts, the terror groups are finding so many ways and a fertile ground and opportunities that they play very well on in order to, first of all, define their target and recruit people who are ready and fed up. The problem is that with the situation of lack of governance from the government, that the terror groups are not finding a competing enemy for them. So they're not, when you lose everything on providing, proper, civics services to people, and also in terms of security and all other forms of governance, actually give an opportunity to these groups, because you don't have much to lose. That's the situation. Now, we're not talking about Sinai, but everything down from, from Lower Egypt, from Cairo into the south, things also get deteriorated. More isolation in Minya and Asyut and other governorates, where they feel that they actually don't have the same attention that, like Central Cairo. Now, the Egyptian government, instead of actually addressing these issues, failing to do anything significant in the economy or the security or and also when they talk about investments and the work that they do, in terms of loans and more funding road to help the economy, it also goes to irrelevant mega projects, just to make things look as if there is some sort of delivery on something. So having the new capital city, or the new Cairo, as they have, building some mega construction, something, along the lines of the Pentagon, having the octagon or the hexagon or something like that, is like ridiculously expensive and unnecessary, and raises questions of how the government is spending its money at a time there is a dire need of providing subsidy, creating projects that actually create employment for the Egyptian people. As you said, you're poverty. That was before the devaluation, reaching around 18 to the dollar, or a little bit less than that, and that's affecting how people are living their lives and able to barely survive. Now, in addition to that, this creates a dynamic that is very contentious. You're having a huge number of the population that are suffering. Their needs are not met. And at the same time, there's a dynamic where you've closed all the peaceful political channels of communication with the government. The parliament is basically just not really functioning as a parliament should be, as an oversight of the government, just basically signing off on any of the decrees or the decisions made by the government. And at the same time, you have a very dangerous dynamics. The state institutions are remaining as they have been the same. The powerful ones have been bark. Yet they feel that they are more vulnerable, so they act in a dynamic of self-preservation. Of Interior or the security sector feels that they have to protect themselves. Same thing with the judiciary. Have their own, as an institute internally, they need to have to preserve this institution. In order to do that, they have a dynamic that sends a message all the time to the rest of the state institutions. Their survival depends on them. So the more actually there are protests, the more there are signs of discomfort or dismay or anger in the streets, actually creates more aggression from the side of the Ministry of Interior or the security sector, because it sends a message to the presidency and the rest of the institution that we are protecting you from this. So one, we are going to continue to do this. And two, you are not to prosecute any of our people because of cases of torture or anything that we have been surfacing, that we've seen either through social media or through the remaining few organizations that are trying to document torture or forced disappearances and all the other human rights violations. And because of that, it goes in a mutual dynamic between judiciary. Haven't seen any real inclination for an actual verdict indicting any of the officers that have been involved in torture. I mean, like with clear cases, with proofs. So this dynamics, I mean, like it goes like a vicious circle in a way that is very dangerous, because it would only take a small trigger that things would go.
Samia, so if Egypt has lost its political dynamics, its political channels in which government and opposition or plurality of political actors engage, be it in parliament or outside of parliament, the same cannot be said about Morocco. So Morocco has a democratically elected parliament. Morocco has a plurality of actors, parties represented in parliament. Morocco has, as you were saying, I mean, for the second term, we have a democratically legitimated government coming out of parliament and out of relatively fair and transparent elections. However, looking at the protests in the Reef, I found it very striking that, first of all, the discourse coming from the monarchy as well as from the government, from the leading, from the Party for Justice and Development, was a discourse dismissive of people's needs, economic needs, of people's complaints with regard to their entitlements as citizens, with regard to lacking equal citizenship rights. I found it surprising that not only the monarchy, but the democratically elected government responded to what seemed to me like legitimate concerns of citizens in a highly authoritarian manner. Not very different, not as violent, not as aggressive as you would get elsewhere, in neighboring Algeria maybe, in not that close Egypt or elsewhere, but in essence, quite as authoritarian, as dismissive of citizens' claims. So where does it come from? Morocco is a place with stable politics, with if not vibrant, but a stable civil society sphere that has not been shrinking in recent years, unlike Egypt, unlike places like Yemen, where civil society is basically in collapse due to the civil war, in a way in collapse, in a way reviving. I'll get back to Farah on that. So how can we explain that?
I think it goes back to this history with the Reef region. One of the first, actually the first official government statement that was released in response to the protests was to dismiss them and characterize them as separatists. And this was due to the fact that in a number of protests, they would actually wave the Reef Republic flag, which is a very distinct flag from, the brief tenure of the Reef Republic in the 1920s. And then when you talk to people in the Reef and you tell them, what are your responses to the government, and pro-government voices accusing you of separatism, and why are you raising the Reef flag instead of the Moroccan flag? And they tell you this is part of our history and identity just as much as, Fes or Marrakesh unique history is part of theirs. So us waving this flag does not mean that we are being separatists. And I think that what sort of worried and scared the government in a way was that the Hirak and the leadership of the Hirak categorically refused any association or alliance with any political movement or party, from as far left to the far right. And I'm talking about, a Najd Demokrati, which is a well-known leftist party that boycotts elections, to as far right as the Islamist Adul Ihsan movement, which itself also boycotts elections, both which have fairly critical views towards the monarchy. But, the leader of the Hirak movement, Nasser Zafzafi, who's currently in prison, notoriously said and described them as dekakin siyasiya, or political shops, to sort of characterize, the transactions, the money that flows through these groups and these parties. And they didn't want to have anything to do with that. So I think that that forced the government to realize, okay, we need to change the way that we deal with these protests, and specifically with the Reef protests. But history has proven itself that the response tends to be, the quick fix of exclusionary measures that include widespread arrests and violent repression, instead of the more difficult, strategy of inclusionary politics. And Nasser Zafzafi, the leader, as well as the other leaders of the Hirak, demanded that we don't want to negotiate with representatives of the government, because we recognize and know that the government doesn't actually wield significant power. If you want us to negotiate, bring us representatives of the palace, which the palace didn't and probably will not. And so I think that this is sort of like a textbook case of how, we have these notions of like the transition paradigm and how elections and having a parliament and having a constitution are so important on paper. But in reality, the monarchy is trying to place itself above politics. In the last Throne Day speech, the king spent a significant portion of the speech slamming the government, slamming the public sector, slamming public administration, party officials. Basically, I mean, it was almost a reiteration of what people on the streets are saying. And he basically threatened that if you don't take responsibility for your actions and actually do the jobs that you're supposed to do, then I'm going to intervene. And here, people interpret it as him dissolving the government, which, it didn't happen, but it's still a looming possibility. And so I think that in some, a stable democratic system in Morocco, and for true governance to happen in Morocco that is centered around accountability, will have to come at the expense of diverting power away from the monarchy and the palace. And you have even the government that exists now. Yes, it was elected, right? But when the king decided to force Ben Kiran out, replace him with Saad al-Din Uthmani, and the main reason for the blockage was because of the question of who was going to join the coalition government. And one of the parties that was really imposing itself in the coalition government was the USFP, which won less than 5% of the parliamentary seats. Now, a coalition government, you kind of wonder, you won less than 5% of the seats. What puts you in a position to rule as part of the government? Yet, they had their way, and now you actually have a government that does not actually reflect the electoral outcome of the 2016 elections. All of the strategic ministerial portfolios are out of the hands of the Party of Justice and Development. You have the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Justice, all either managed by members of the National Rally of Independence, which was a party founded by an extended member of the royal family, or by technocrats. So I think that sort of represents and demonstrates how this sort of doesn't stand yet.
Thank you, Samia. Farah, let me come to you before opening up and starting our Q&A session. So Samia was just saying, well, you can have the best constitution on paper, have a parliament endowed with legislative and oversight competencies, but the reality of politics sometimes take you somewhere else. So now in Yemen, before the war, before the current situation started to unfold, Yemen was a place with a plurality of political parties. In fact, a plurality of political parties representing various shades ideologically, Islamist and non-Islamist, leftist, right-wing party, somewhere tribal-based, somewhere less tribal-based, a bit of tribal-based exists everywhere. But this was a place with plurality of, with some pluralism in politics and political sphere. This was a place with a very vibrant civil society prior to 2011. So the untold story of Yemen since the unification of the two Yemens in the 1990s has been the rise of independent, autonomous civil society actors. To an extent, we in Egypt were quite envious of what was happening in Yemen, as we were envious of places like back then Jordan and back then Morocco in the 1990s. So what is happening to civil society in Yemen? How are civil society actors managing the current situation? And where are political parties? I mean, we hardly hear about anyone apart from al-Houthis, apart from the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh and his and of course the Saudi supported, promoted, funded coalition ruling out of Aden. So if we can move beyond them, beyond key actors in the current war on Yemen, where is civil society and where are political actors?
Yeah, we had the first parliamentary election in the Arabian Peninsula in 1993. Actually, you're right. Before that, the south of Yemen was so socialist to the point, at one point, the head of the state was fired because he married a second wife. And that was that much of a strict. And we had a quite tremendous experience of political parties, of pluralism throughout the last 50 years. And Yemen is a very dynamic country, and that's why I think we get exhausted right now following the news about it. But it's a dynamic country. For the last 50 years, we have seen monarchy, we have seen Marxism in the South Republic, we have seen the wave of parliament, we joined the wave of the Arab Spring. it is an exhausting country from a historical point of view in a good way. It moves very quickly. It responds to the international development around the world, despite the relatively stable neighborhood around it, which doesn't respond into anything except in wars. So that's something. It is a unique, but it has to do with the fact that there is a political culture. There is an experience for thousands of years, for hundreds of years. And there is a difference between the political and the historical Yemen. The political Yemen cannot change overnight, and it goes all the way right, left. But the historical Yemen is a stable thing, and that there is a country there is a place called Yemen, and it's a very dynamic, and it's a terrible maker in the positive meaning of the word for politics. The problem for the last 2 years, and this is why this war is not like anything we have ever seen in Yemen. We have had conflicts, we have always had violence, but never in this massive, never this, you have 12 countries at least right now, and you have almost everyone in the ground fighting everyone, and too many countries are from outside. What did that do, and I think that's mostly because of 2216 UN Security Council resolution, which basically brought a lot of legal justification to this war, is it banned politics. There is no politics, basically, for the last 3 years. There is no politics. There is a fight, there is a war. At any side, you speak to the Houthis, the ones who used, the very little ones who used to think amongst them are sidelined right now. The other side also, only those in the military or only those who are fighters are taking the lead into it. And that's what war does anyway. Now, I wouldn't call it, depending on which side you take. If you are on the Saudi side, you will say the war started in September 21st, 2014, when the Houthis took over. If you are in the Houthi side, you will say the war started actually in March 25, 2015. But if you are someone with a centimeter of a brain, I think you will go back to 2011. You will go back to the consequence faulty political process that ultimately led to this war. It didn't happen without the context. The Houthis didn't suddenly march to Sana'a and took it over. They were taking battles since 2011. There was a process, because it was a fraud process, because it was a deceptive process, and because it was a process that had to look okay, that doesn't have to be okay. It had to look okay, and it looked okay, actually. And ultimately, that led into the absence or the destruction of politics, basically, and taking the country into a war from an external and from an internal point of view. Very marginalized right now, the civil society, because, for example, if you're a civil society right now in Sana'a, you cannot do anything or even an event until you get a permission from the Houthi section 10 days ago from the Houthi police. 10 days ago, you have to report where you're doing, who you are bringing, who give you this money, and even hand them out the agenda. 10 days ago, 10 days ahead. There is no, they don't joke about that. There is no space for civil society. There is, I was in Sana'a last month, and there is zero newspaper that's not the Houthi newspaper. Zero. We had more than 22 at one point newspapers around the country. And this is why I say Yemen is dynamic. We have 50% almost of illiteracy in Yemen, but we had 4 English newspapers a weekly, more than Lebanon had, actually. But all of this is basically shut off right now, whether from this side or of that side. And I think that's, out of everything this war is doing, that's the most dangerous thing. It's illegalizing politics. In a country that was run by politics, even when there was some sort of authoritarian, some sort of corruption, there was politics. That was something that Yemenis were used to and practiced, contrary to Libyans, contrary to Syria, contrary to many other regional nations. There was a political experience in a country like Yemen.
Very much fair. Thank you all. We're coming now to you. We have half an hour for what's hopefully going to be a vibrant Q&A session. I'm afraid the narrative, to use Nancy's terminology, the panel shared with us is not a pleasant one. But it's an interesting narrative in spite of its gloomy nature, because it has a great deal of details and differences and similarities between 3 quite distinct countries, each one in itself, but yet some interesting reflections which came out of the panel with regard to how vibrant formal politics and formal political dynamics can be, what are their impacts when they are not as vibrant, what happens when you extinct civil society and shut off spaces for freedom of expression and their impacts on security and governance in these three countries. So let's open it up. And I'm taking Intisar. We'll collect questions to give you more time to share your ideas. So we'll start with Intisar. We'll take rounds of 3 questions each.
Thank you, guys. My question is specific to Samia, but I'd love to hear others' thoughts on this. Samia, you bring up a really important point, which is the question of accountability, which goes not only to the heart of governance, but it also goes to power dynamic in Morocco between the different players. So you have the palace, which controls politics completely, but somehow manages to stay above it. And in terms of governance, it controls that as well, but devolves just enough responsibility to the government so that they can blame them should anything go wrong. And in my mind, I can only think of 2 examples where the monarchy has been held, accountable in one way or another. The reef protests that you bring up, and I can't remember if it was 2013 or 2014, when the Spanish pedophile was pardoned. Do you see this as sort of a bigger shift where there's more willingness to really hold the real power brokers responsible? Or do you see these as just sort of, momentary things that happen that may not amount to much? Thanks.
Thank you, Intisar. Mirvat? I'll be moving between left and right, front rows and back rows, so bear with me. Mirvat.
Thank you. Mirvat Hatem, Howard University. I'm kind of struck by the 2 cases, Egypt and Yemen, are cases, of course, where the Arab uprisings took place and were somewhat successful. They certainly forced those who had been in power for a very long time to step down. And yet, obviously, they have not been as successful in negotiating a transition to a system that would take the demands of bread, liberty, social justice, and dignity into effect. And it seems like what happened was, as a result, is basically the use of security. I'm sorry, that's me.
I was just going to say.
Okay. So security seems to have replaced politics, and this is perhaps the marker of the outcome, the political outcome that occurred in both Egypt and in Yemen. If that is the case, what kind of a political bargain is behind this? If it replaced politics, if security has replaced politics, then there must be a political bargain that has been struck by those who are in power and some groups in those societies. And so, I mean, we need to be thinking about that in trying to figure out who benefits, who are the losers in this.
Okay, so I'm seeing Perry.
Hi, Perry Kamak with Carnegie. Thanks for 3 good presentations. My question is for Farah. You kind of talked about this interesting juxtaposition of a country which has kind of a lot of fragility in its politics and political institutions, kind of superimposed on this continuity of social and cultural institutions. And I'm kind of struck that the tragedy really of the Yemeni civil war now is that the international intervention has kind of blocked these deeper cultural, social institutions from their normal kind of conflict resolution mode. And I'm just wondering if this is a kind of transient moment, if there were a way to kind of de-escalate both from the Arabian Peninsula, from Iran, kind of make this a local conflict rather than an international one. Can these indigenous conflict resolutions be kind of resuscitated, or is the damage permanent? And really the related question is, what then would it take to kind of end sustainably the conflict there? Thanks.
Okay, let's take one more question before coming back to our panel. Please go ahead. So here in the front.
Thank you, Mike Kurtzig. Nancy, I see in your title Tahrir Institute. Tahrir is a very special place, Tahrir Square. What happened to that? What happened to the people who were there? What are they saying? What are they doing? Is there a difference now between Mubarak and Sisi? Because we read in the headlines Sisi is as bad, if not worse, than Mubarak. What's going on there? And could you give us a little bit of the impact of the fact that the United States is withholding aid at the moment? And what does the military say about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's come back. Would you mind saying your name again? So let's come back to the panel. I would like to have at least 2 more rounds of questions. I saw many hands. So let's try to be brief, and let's go in a reversed order to Farah, followed by Samia, followed by Nancy. And if each one of you can maybe take 2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll take less because I don't know the answers. Much less than that. Yes, I think it's a very...
So time is up.
But no, you have to kind of...
The tribal way. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think, yes, I think it's very important to dig out who's behind this and who's benefiting from what. And I really think that's something we lack as scholars or as people who are looking for ideas. This is especially important because public opinion we have in our part of the world is built on rumors, not on information. And there are some interests that remain there that are benefiting from the war and that will benefit, and we're unable to see who's behind them. A very specific example of behind this security order, for example, in 2013, we had a very famous research, Chatham House, that showed that we had 10 families in Yemen that controlled 86% of the imports, exports, banking, communication, and basically the top 10 source of wealth in the country by 10 families. These families, for example, are still players even today in Yemen, and nothing had changed with them after 2011. They were players and they remain players, and this is something no one is really digging on who's behind that, and I share your concern. When it comes to the, can there be a local process? Yes. If this was left to Yemenis, we can solve this war. We have an excellent historical experience in dealing with conflicts and with conflict resolution. It is, but the problem is yes, it is a war about Yemen, or it started about Yemen, but it's no more in the hand of Yemen, and it no more has to do with Yemen. A very specific example I was referring to last night is in Yemen. We had the tribes at one point, for example, last year. They had a gathering for 2 hours and they freed 800 prisoners. The UN envoy went to Yemen and he had a Chapter 7 behind him and he freed 4 prisoners. So these local domestic conflict resolution models are highly underlooked and highly can be brought. Right now they're being used for war reasons. You get the tribes to fight, you get them to do this, but no one has used that from a conflict resolution point of view, and I think can be very, very important if we explore them.
Very much. Samia?
Yeah, on the question of accountability, I mean, what's so interesting is, and this is a trend for years, for example, you go to a protest in a remote village, for example, and people are protesting because their land is being stolen or, very local reason, and they're carrying pictures of the king, appealing to the king. So I think there's there has always been that appealing to the power of the monarchy because people know that that's where the power lies. In terms of accountability, I still don't even think we're there yet, because if we do start considering the accountability that the palace should be held for, then that would open up a huge Pandora's box. I mean, just look at the role of the king in the private sector, for example. I mean, essentially every single sector, the royal holding firm has a portion of control over. Including monopolies on sugar, for example, which is something that is subsidies that are controlled by the government. So in terms of accountability, I don't think that we're there yet. But, I think it's sort of relevant to point out in this context how the regionalization plan was intended to divert power and the centralization of Rabat away to these 12 regions in Morocco, right? But the way it unfolded was kind of counterproductive and in fact just further bolstered the inefficiency and the bloated nature of the public administration, public sector, because you had 12 regions that are governed by 12 different walis that are governors that are appointed by the king, and then 12 different presidents that are elected from local elections. So you have a wali and a president, and who is held responsible for what? And not to mention that this trickles down to like the basic public administrative task. I mean, just to get a residency certificate or a marriage license, I mean, what processes you have to go through that sort of all go back to this dual executive nature. And the fact that, yeah, just to reiterate, I don't think that we're at a point of accountability for the palace just yet. But I think people have not shied away from being very explicit and openly acknowledging that they know that the palace is the one that wields power in the country and not the government.
And Tisar, Mervat, and Michael in 15 seconds. No, it wasn't successful. I wouldn't consider Egypt as a success story. And Sisi is worse than Mubarak. But just to elaborate on this, things are not that simplistic, but when you see, I mean, when people took to the streets, as Mervat was saying, they were hoping for freedom, bread, and justice, and none of this has been achieved. And in terms of accountability, it goes across board on all levels of people in the government and official. No one was held accountable for anything, starting by Mubarak himself. I was just yesterday pictures of him, having his summer vacation in the northern coast with his granddaughter and his son, which is very provocative. And actually, as things are even worse right now, instead of people just frowning upon things like that, people are reminiscing of the good old days of Mubarak, when people are not like forcibly disappeared or tortured to death by that level of numbers. Was he good? No. It just what we're seeing right now is a continuation of a corrupt system with lack of accountability. There are no structural changes that happen in the country. Going back to the question that, or the statement that Mervat made, was like, was there a bargain there for security? Again, there is a very critical issue when we talk about security and how the West view it and how people inside these countries are viewing it. Security, well, first of all, the quest for freedom and democracy transformed over time, just lowering the bar just to have some stability and have some, decreasing the amount of terror attacks. So it turned from democracy to security to terrorism. But even when we talk about terrorism, and that's the biggest problem of the West, and that talks a little bit about the point of cutting aid and what the West views. When we talk about terrorism, everyone is, instead of looking at security, is looking at containment. That violence is tolerated as long as it's contained within the border. If it spills out outside of this region, it becomes a bigger problem and people pay attention. But as long as it is contained, even terrorism is tolerated. And that's hugely problematic because this is not a sustainable situation. And sooner or later, they spill out and get out of hand. But what the West is dealing with the region, whether we're talking about Syria, whether we're talking about Yemen, and particularly when we're talking about Egypt, because they see it as a better example in the rest of the country, with the exception of Tunisia, things are contained, then it's fine. But they're not. Because actually going back to the comparison between Mubarak and Sisi, it's the same structural challenges that we have been seeing, the failure of the institute. The only difference between, I would say, and there are a few differences. Of course, the level of repression is unprecedented. We haven't seen that level of, torture, forced disappearances. To ask where are the people who were in Tahrir, case in point, they are in exile, or they are in jail, or there are ones who are not in jail and are not exiled, but they are banned from traveling, their assets are freezed. So basically, instead of the government have learned even from their mistake, becoming more strategic, they're not putting people in jail and they're not closing down organizations, but they're freezing their assets. So they cannot travel, they cannot do their work, and they're just living there just like in confinement, basically. So they're completely killing and crippling the civil and at the same time, there are no, first of all, the documentation. First of all, a pre-step for accountability that Intisar is asking about is to document. Before you go into accountability, and the government is ahead of the game in this. It's just like crippling any attempts for, and you cannot take this to the next level of, judicial process or anything. So bottom line, there's no accountability, and the West is only concerned with this morning, we've seen the Senate House, the Appropriation Committee, and seeing that aid to be cut for 1 billion to 1 billion, and raising the human rights condition to 25%. This is good, okay? But the problem with the U.S. policy towards Egypt, first of all, it has an inflated sense of control, of what's going on inside the country, and second, there is a complete lack of coherence. So they would make just one gesture like that, but there is no follow-up, and it's like patting on the back on the other issues that are going on within the country. So basically, the government feels that they have like a carte blanche to do whatever they want to do, and there are no consequences for what's happening.
Nancy, so let's open up for your questions again. I'm going to start with the last 4 rows, then the middle 4 rows, and the first 2 rows. Just to get more of a representative sample. Any questions in the last 4 rows? Yes, please go ahead. And would you mind introducing yourself to everyone?
Yeah. Badr al-Bandari from Maxwell School. So my question is to Nancy. I want to go back to the terrorist groups in Egypt, actually, especially. We cannot say it, they're only in Sinai, they're all over Egypt. So as you mentioned, there are like Wilayat Sina, there is like Lewa Saura, there's Hassim, and there's also, you mentioned that interview about the Islamic State representative there. So do you think this diversity of those movements or those groups, does it indicate to that propaganda that they want to make, that they are a lot and they want to increase their position against and increasing the sense of instability, or it's a matter of there is a real division among them? They are all sharing the same ideology, the Islamic ideology, but is it really different from all of them? Does this indicate to a real difference between their ideology? And does that indicate to a complete chaotic scene in case of a complete failure of the state? Thank you.
Thank you, Badr. Please go ahead.
3 quick sort of questions that are all the same idea, one for each of you. What do the people who are creating the security problem in Egypt want? What do they want? And the same question for Morocco, which is, okay, all the people in al-Muslimi who are making all this fuss, what do they want? Can they point to a region and say, treat us like that region? I don't know. And finally, for Yemen, I'm going to challenge you on the notion of a Yemen. What is it they're looking for? What's the Yemen that these traditional forces could coalesce to create? What is that Yemen? Because right now they've coalesced to create a series of smaller Yemens that seem to respond to what they want. So what's the geographic political entity that they could and should coalesce to create? Because there's a lot of options historically. And then the final overall question is, how much of this is driven by bored young men? Any of the countries.
Okay, thank you. Bored young men. So right here. So we'll take, if you agree, we'll take 2 or 3 more questions. And this is the last round, and then come back to you. Please.
Thank you. Fawad Shah with the National Center for State Courts. 2 questions. First one, Egypt, and then Yemen. Egypt, a couple years back, under the Sisi regime, they passed anti-terrorism legislation focusing on behalf of state security. These laws have been broadly translated, interpreted to the point where, if you look, people across society have been arrested, detained people are in pre-trial for months, if not years, without seeing a judge. Once in court, their case it goes through within minutes, if half an hour if they're lucky. And this is happening time and time again. People are being targeted, students, youth, elderly. Someone says something in the wrong place in a metro stop, they're being arrested. The son says something on Facebook, he's being detained by state security. And again, these cases are being tracked, and the question is, does the government not see what they're doing is creating breeding grounds, just as what happened in Iraq when all these populations were being arrested through blanket arrest, blanket policies. For Yemen, Yemeni-born Arab American, and seeing all that's been happening, you listed a long list of crises in Yemen, the civil war, the grievances of decades, cholera outbreak, refugee, humanitarian situation, the list goes on and on. How do we step back? How do we say, where are we going with this? Yemeni people are resilient and they're able to conduct very good understanding of any conflict, as you said, historically, but I think the Pandora box has been opened and we are having a hard time closing it back, and we don't know where to start or where to end it, and it just seems like a black hole right now.
Thank you very much. To your right, please.
Mine's quick. To Samia, in addition to what the demands of the protesters are, I'd like to just sort of widen that question a little bit. This panel was about security and governance, so you didn't go that much into the economics of it all, but this was an informal sector actor. There are a number of economic responses by the government, perhaps better than the political ones. There are all these, the mega projects, and you touched on all this, but I was wondering if you could sort of widen the lens a little bit, talk about the reef economy, and in that context, what the correct solution is. If it isn't mega projects,
Okay, any more questions? Last question.
Yeah, so just a background. A bit of anecdotal evidence here, but I spent 2 years in Egypt, and I remember kind of prior to the Arab Spring, everyone being really, really surprised when Egypt fell, because they thought that Mubarak's hold was so strong, and when Egypt fell, everyone just thought, oh, well, this is our chance. If it can happen in Egypt, it can happen anywhere. But talking to people and my friends in Egypt that were in Tahrir Square, they've almost fell into this kind of crippling apathy that they're like, well, it's not going to happen again. We did it once. We couldn't get the change. We might as well accept the status quo. There's always going to be kind of this security apparatus. People are always going to disappear. And I'm wondering if that is true everywhere, if to a certain extent, Egypt's lost its political will, that it's going to be almost impossible to mobilize this population again outside of the people at the opposite ends, the people like you that are in exile, or that ran for parliament, or the people that are in Sinai and are extremists. I'm wondering if that middle part is ever going to be mobilized again, if there's an opportunity for that.
Thank you all very, very much. Now coming back to you. So we're running out of time. So each one will get, I would say, 1 minute. And we will then have a short break, 15 minutes, and come back to our next session. So thank you all very much once again, and let's start with you, Nancy.
Starting by Bad's question about the diversity of the terror groups, I don't think that they are competing against each other. I think it just they're taking opportunity of a gap that is there and a reason for people to join them for their target. They changed it. All groups that you've mentioned, like Hasm and Wilayat Sinai, as I mentioned at the beginning, they force in messaging very quickly and very adaptively. And that's one of their biggest strengths, because this is all what they can do because they have nothing. They're not as powerful as they seem. They have the ability to inflict that harm that they promise, but at the same time they're still if there's the right strategy in place, there is an ability to control. Going to the question of what do these people want, and if they are just bored young men, I don't think they are bored at all. They are struggling all the time, and they are dealing with a lot of sufferings economically and in terms of their basic rights and freedoms, and basically, and in some areas in Egypt, just survival. I mean, just meeting their basic needs. So they're not bored men, and they're not just men. And what do they need is just basic rights like anyone would want. A question about if the government is not seeing how this is a fertile ground for breeding radicalization, and whether or not also combining that with the question of if there's apathy out there right now in Egypt. I think the government sees that there are huge problems facing the country, but I think the response, instead of trying to address those, is just like putting the stopper back on those problems and silencing everyone. They have some conditions that are working well for the government. They're not sustainable. Some of these conditions is the relative stable position of Egypt, or state compared to the rest of the region, particularly when we compare. They're using a sort of an extortionist argument when they talk to or the United States, is that we are actually, you don't want to see the country in refugee crisis that erupted in Syria coming from Egypt with a country of over 90 million people. So that's also working well for them as a sort of getting international support to the current regime. And the third thing is like just what we see as a lack of alternative, or a lack of obvious alternative right now, which works well with, and they play on this narrative with, with the people who are seeing it as well. The Egyptian people, what's happening there. Is there apathy? I don't think so, and I wouldn't call it apathy. I call it like struggling more, despite all the unprecedented levels of repression that we're seeing in the country in terms of imprisonment and forced disappearance and travel bans, you name it. People are still trying to find ways to work. Civil society organizations that had their assets freeze are working from home. Websites, for example, like Madame Masr, whose website would have been banned from Egypt, are posting on Facebook and other channels. There's still this perseverance to continue on doing work, following up on what's happening, and continuing the advocacy work that they are doing. So apathy is not a word that I would use to describe the current situation.
Yeah, quickly. So I think I mentioned earlier that the Hirak actually published very succinct demands for during the protest, the manifesto, which they demanded a cancer hospital, a university, improved infrastructure, namely a highway, and jobs. So for that question. And thank you for the economic question, because that was actually a point that I really wanted to get to, which is that one of the factors that plays into this whole thing was earlier this year, Morocco was supposed to implement its first stage of floating the currency. And the day before, literally the day before, actually hours, the central bank sent out an email to all the journalists saying it's been indefinitely postponed with no given reason. And I think we all can kind of discern that the fear was that there may possibly be an Egyptian scenario with just the increasing inflation rate. But also there was, I think exactly. So $4.4 billion of the foreign reserves were depleted in the last 4 months. And that was largely attributed to speculation of the devaluation of the currency. So that's just sort of like general economic context. For Reef specifically, the latest figures, as per the High Commission of Planning, say that unemployment rate in the Reef is at 16%, which is way above the national average of around 9%. And they have the lowest rate of public and private investment, and many interpret that as sort of like a punishment that Hassan II kind of, put against them because of the protests. And this has in turn prompted a huge exodus of migrants to Europe, primarily Netherlands, Belgium, and Spain, and they are essentially the economic lifeline to the Reef through remittances. So,
Thank you, Sam. Farah?
Yes. So, I mean, just on the point on ISIS, Qaeda, and how different and similar these are, it's a very important point because I think we're still, even the counterterrorism, all the security policy are responding to one type of a group, one type of terrorist that only exists anymore in their mind. In the ground, there have been so many of them. There is ISIS, there is Qaeda, there is Ansar al-Sharia, and these are all very different groups. Some full-time terrorists, part-time terrorists, some, it's a very different dynamic, and it's important to identify them, and it's important to see how they function. In Al-Bayda, for example, Middle Yemen, I just like 1 minute, otherwise I'll feel marginalized as Yemen. Sure. Like the usual case. So on that,
you are sharing a panel with marginalized intellectuals.
No, but it's important to understand the type of these groups and how they function because they're not one coherent group. In Middle Yemen, for example, people who were fighting with al-Dhahab, who was killed by drone strike, refused to pray. They say, we didn't sign up for this. We signed up to fight with you, not to pray. That's not our job. It's from a political science point of view, I think there should be an investment in trying to understand this. Second, I don't think this is as much about bored young men as much as the problem is we have states that are run by boring old men. And that's their main difference between them and the militias. The militias have young, they're quick, and they move, and they're efficient. You look to Tunisia, you look to Yemen, you look to the Gulf, you look to Egypt. These are countries where there are people running them older between 70s and 80s. And they have the highest demographics of young people around the world. That's a really tremendous problem no one focuses on and no one looks into. Finally, where to start in Yemen? I think it's very important to go back to 2216 resolution inside the UN Security Council. That is a resolution that commits to war, and we need a resolution that commits to peace in Yemen. And that is that's the beginning to start with it. Is Yemen has a chance? I agree. I think there is a problem with it. There is a lot of problems, but I bet you the differences between Hashid and Bakil tribes in Yemen are so much less than those right now, or those divisions between the Republicans and Democrats here. It's a place that can function ultimately. It can run this. What is the way look like? Probably federal Yemen. It has to be changed. It has to be not done the way it was done, which is a hush, rush, not thought of a process, but that can be something. And that's a formula I think that we can manage and should end up managing, working, if there is enough regional and international commitment toward it. Right now, there is none.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. We'll have a 10-minute break and come back to the next session.